Most of us may have heard of C.S. Lewis. In fact, most of us may know that name because we read his famous series of books, The Chronicles of Narnia, or seen the movies, Chronicles of Narnia, and he's well known for those books. Many of us may know that C.S. Lewis was well known for writing other famous books. One of them called The Screw Tape Letters, which is this really funny and interesting book in which two demons write letters to each other. One who's a mentor demon trying to help another lesser demon, and it's kind of a letter about how to tempt human beings away from faith and living a good life. It's a fascinating, fun little read if you've never had it, and I actually think it's one of the most insightful little tiny books about the human condition and the ways in which we can delude ourselves. So, and he was famous as well for being a theologian who wrote books on the Christian faith and defended the faith. Lived in the middle of the 20th century. Well known for all the lectures he would go. Intellect, a professor at Oxford University. You may not know that he was really good friends with J.R. Tolkien, who wrote The Lord of the Rings. They were great friends. In fact, Tolkien had a great impact on him. What you may not know is that C.S. Lewis, the early part of his life, was an atheist. That in many ways, or at least an agnostic, that in many ways he had rejected the faith of his childhood, couldn't wrap his mind around it intellectually, and really resisted a kind of religious faith and didn't fully understand what people thought about God and the ways in which they were thinking. And he wrote this really interesting book called Surprised by Joy, which describes his journey of faith from being an agnostic atheist to becoming a passionate follower of God and Jesus Christ. And he describes what he experienced in his life as he walked through the woods. He did daily walks all the time as he had conversations with his friend J.R. Tolkien, who talked about his own faith as he read and thought about things, this growing realization that, as he put it, he was being pursued by God. And he does what probably should be recommended to anybody when feeling pursued by God, is you run away as fast as you can. And if you can't get away, you know it's God. But he describes that this one particular night in 1929 in his cottage at Oxford, that it all came to a head, and he just felt like he couldn't escape, and he had this profound experience of God's incredible presence. And in that moment of acceptance, experienced something beautiful. And one of his comments, I want to read this line to you because I think in which he described his own realization here. He says, the prodigal son at least walked home on their own feet. But myself, who can duly adore that love, who will open the high gates to a prodigal who is, in describing himself, brought in kicking, struggling, resentful, and darting his eyes in every direction for a chance of escape. And he could not escape. As he would say later, the hardness of God is softer than the deepest kindness of God, of any human being. The hardness of God is softer than any kindness of human beings. And God's compulsion is always for us, he would say, liberation. So here he was, he'd run away for most of his life, and he had this constant sin of being hounded by the grace of God until finally he opens himself to that moment, and he has this profound, beautiful experience of joy. Something beyond happiness, something beyond contentment. He experienced joy. And if you think about it, and he reflects on this somewhat, why is it we run away from joy? Because I think we do. The story of Elizabeth only takes up a few verses in the first chapter of Luke. She seems almost an afterthought. And in this story, we know that Zechariah has come, that Elizabeth, who had been barren, had become pregnant and will soon be the mother of John the Baptist. And in this story, she's at home, and Mary comes to visit her, and they have this encounter with each other, this relationship. Mary's come to support her friend and care for her friend, and Elizabeth is overjoyed to see Mary. Now, what's interesting about this story is that we don't often realize that in the first century Judea of the time, that we don't realize how oppressed women were. That in fact, if you look in the text, if you read the text, Mary, it says, comes to the house of Zechariah, not to the house of Elizabeth, because women had no rights. The Gospel of Luke is famous for saying God is most present in those people who have no rights or are oppressed in the life of the world. And so they come in mutual support, and there's this brief encounter in which it's described that the child within Elizabeth leaps for joy within her womb. Leaps for joy within her heart. So there's a recognition in that moment of something profoundly going on, that this is the mother of the Lord. So like C.S. Lewis, joy becomes the way in which one responds to and understands who God is. Now, through thousands of years, people who write on spirituality for hundreds of years at least, for sure, have wrestled with the question, how do we recognize God in the world around us? How do we recognize God in ourselves? The word they use is, how do we discern God's Spirit in the midst of the world? How do we hear God's voice when there are so many voices in the world, even voices within us, our ego, our pride? How do we discern God's voice in the midst of all those many, many voices? And the simple answer in the stories of the Scripture is you recognize God's voice because it is always a voice of joy. Of grace. Of compassion. That's how you know it's God's voice speaking to you. So why, this conundrum, do we run away from joy? I think the worst disservice we do to the church as followers of Jesus, or the worst disservice we do to our God in the world, is we make church joyless. And we can't. We can make it about work. We can make it about, there are many who turn Christianity into this moralistic, demeaning, judgmental kind of faith, and it has nothing to do with joy. But if we truly want to reflect the grace of God as a community, as individuals, we will reflect and speak that joy. So how do we know God's voice? How do we know where God is guiding us? What brings you joy? Whether it's the music here on Sunday morning, or standing there before a sunrise, or feeding a person who's hungry, or housing someone who has no home, or whether it's just a simple conversation with your friend that you connect and recognize each other, you know that joy is God. The leaping joy within you. It's more than happiness, more than contentment. That's profoundly meaningful. Now, you may not have heard, has anybody here seen the movie Shadowlands? I don't know if anybody's seen that. Jared has. Yes. Shadowlands, which is a story that tells the story, it was a play originally, tells the story of C.S. Lewis later in his life. And what's interesting about this story is that C.S. Lewis was rather famous. He was famous for defending the faith and giving lectures and having all the answers about the Christian faith. And in this movie and in the play as well, what happens is he meets a woman, a divorcee. Her name is Joy Grisham. He meets this woman who's come over to study, and they kind of encounter each other. She's a divorcee with a grown son. And they kind of strike up this friendship. It's a rather meaningful friendship and conversation. He's kind of a crusty old English professor, rather stuffy, and she's full of life, and they strike up this friendship. And then through a series of events, they decide, in order for her to stay in England with her child and escape a rather difficult situation in America, that the way in which C.S. Lewis can help her is he marries her. And it was just an act so that she could stay in England with her son. But what happens over time is that he and she begin to fall in love. Until they have this and he did not expect this. He was surprised by this gift of joy, both emotional and in that person. And they develop a deep and loving marriage. It's a true story. But a few years into their marriage, she develops bone cancer. Very painfully, very difficultly, she dies. And C.S. Lewis has this profound existential experience in which before, where he had all the answers to suffering and why God does this, had no answer to why this happened. Until he came to the realization that sorrow is not the opposite of joy. That in order for him to feel this deep sorrow, he had to truly, deeply love her. And that he would be willing to pay that price for the joy of loving her. So the gift of joy is not simple. It is a reality that if we love people and have the joy of loving each other, that there is sorrow connected to it as well. So I invite you this season to not run away from joy, but embrace it, even in the midst of sorrow. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.